Hey Wargamers, the day is finally here. The new Tau Codex release is on the horizon, but we know what is in that book. We know what the rules are. We know what the options are, and we know what the points breakdown is. So that means that we can start analyzing it, pulling it apart, and figuring out what will work best for us on the tabletop. And so that is what we are going to do today. But where do we start? There's so much information in this new book, especially considering it fundamentally reimagines how the army functions. We have to start from page 1 and work our way through the whole thing as if we've never even heard of Tau. So what do we do to tackle such a monumental task of re-envisioning our own armies? There are many different ways that we could approach this. One of the things we might want to consider is how much offensive output we get per unit based on how much that unit costs. So if there is a unit that does a lot of damage and is very cheap, that might be something we want to consider compared to something that doesn't do much damage but costs a lot of points, right? It's one part of the puzzle that we might want to consider when we're starting to assess the overall composition of the Codex. And so that is what we are going to do today, is look at some of this math hammer, look at some of the points efficiency of a bunch of different units, and pick out the top 6 for a variety of targets. Now again, this is just our first glance at the Codex, our first preliminary assessment of the units, and they're taken at face value. So I want to be clear about the context in which these calculations were performed. For one thing, I'm assuming that rapid-fire weapons are within rapid-fire range. This is because the only rapid-fire weapon left in the Codex really is the pulse rifle. Plasma rifles are assault now, so this really only applies for pulse rifles, and they have a pretty reasonable range, so you can fairly assume that you're going to be within rapid-fire range for a good number of targets. I also use just the standard profiles for fusion and ion weapons because they are not as easily assumed to be operating at that higher impact as rapid fire weapons are, right? So for fusion, you have to be within half range. Fusion's shorter range, so that's harder to do. And so I want to give a more conservative estimate for how fusion might perform. Similarly for ion, the way that ion works is risky if you are overcharging it. And so I, again, took a more conservative approach and said, you're just using ion weapons at their base standard profile. This is something that is important when considering Pathfinders, especially because they are one of the few places where you have ion weapons that you could get a reroll and mitigate that risk. So when you see ion weapons on core units here, keep in mind that their efficiency would be higher if you are overcharging them because they would be doing more damage in that context. Additionally, it doesn't account for any interactions, right? So this is, again, taking units at their face value in isolation, more or less, right? So I'm not accounting for support systems on battlesuits, for example, right? There's no extra hits for multi-trackers on big units or ignoring cover or anything like that. So it's not taking into account support systems. It's also not taking into account the tactical philosophy. So Mod Ka, for example, has a pretty big impact on your output in the turns that it's active. So that's not a consistent thing, and it's certainly not something that's going to apply to every game, and so I've put it to the side here. Additionally, things like your Sept choice, auras from things like a Cadre Fireblade or Invocation of the Elements, or all the different stratagems are not considered here. So all of those things could tweak and really augment the efficiency of select units. So just because you don't see something show up in the top 6 here doesn't mean that it doesn't have a role. It just means that that role might be more context specific. Additionally, this is just Math Hammer. It's not Warhammer, right? Warhammer is the game that we play on the tabletop with our friends, having a good time. This is running calculations that are cold and unfeeling. It doesn't replace the experience or the learning that you do during the game, right? And so this is one piece of the puzzle. It can give us a tool to help narrow down our many different options, but it's not a substitute for all the other things that you normally do to pick your army list. Other things are important besides the offensive capabilities of a unit, right? The utility of that unit, the certain buffs that it gives, those are not accounted for in this offensive point efficiency. So that's something to keep in mind. the defensive capabilities of them, right? How durable they are, how long they stay on the table. Hugely important, especially in 9th edition, and we're not assessing that at all here. And that will come into play, you'll see in a few minutes. And then finally, the mobility. Again, being able to move and get to certain places on the board, totally ignored here. We are saying everyone is within range of things in the certain scenario that we're playing out. We don't have to account for, that unit's actually on the other side of the table, and so we have to move to get in range first, right? That's not something that we consider in these calculations at all. And so again, there's many different parts of the puzzle that you'll put together when you build your army list. This might help you figure out where one piece lands, right? Every time I do one of these videos, there's an outburst in the comments. And so I really want to give that concern the validation and response that it deserves, because it's absolutely true. Math Hammer is not Warhammer, but it is a tool we can use to perhaps improve our performance in the game. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do here is break out a bunch of target profiles. So I'm giving the toughness, the save, the number of wounds, then vulnerable save if it has one. And I've kind of grouped these into different groups of targets. And then I'm giving you the 6 units that are particularly points efficient for that target based on everything that I could find in the Codex, right? So there are over 700 different combinations of crisis suit that you can bring just looking at the weapons and the chassis alone. So across the different commanders, across crisis suits, across crisis bodyguards, more than 700 options that you can bring. Those are all in the spreadsheet. All the different broadside configurations, all the different storm surge configurations, all the different riptide configurations, ghost kill configurations, piranha configurations, hammerhead configurations. You name it, the configurations are in there with the exception of support systems. So this spreadsheet does cast a very wide net, or rather the spreadsheet that I use to perform these calculations spreads a very wide net. And so we're looking at some of the top performers here in a very holistic context with regard to offensive point efficiency. And so let's start with toughness 3, 5-up save, 1 wound. We see that crisis battlesuits are the best performer here out of the Codex, followed by breachers. Generally, this is at the near range, but they maintain that efficiency at the far range as well. Near range is 8 inches, far range is 14 inches. The Cold Star shows up here too, notably with a heavy or a high output burst cannon loadout. So as long as you have one high output burst cannon on a Cold Star, it does pretty darn well against toughness 3, 1 wound models. And then specialist pathfinders. You're going to see specialist pathfinders show up, I think, on every slide here. And those are the ion rifle and the rail rifle pathfinders. I have them isolated here as just the model with the weapon. However, that's not really a great way to do that, because you can't bring just a unit of rail rifle pathfinders, right? You bring a unit of pathfinders and 3 of them have rail rifles. And so there's really 2 additional models, or 2 1/3 additional models that go along with that one. And so maybe we would want to analyze the Pathfinder unit as a unit as opposed to that individual loadout. And if we do that, the efficiency is generally retained, right? It still performs at the top of the category, not quite as high, right? Because there's a tax of sorts, but it still performs very well. So you're going to see specialist pathfinders here. It's generally both the ion and the rail pathfinder. And keep in mind that goes for whether we're talking about just those individuals or the unit as a whole. They perform well when they have those specialist weapons inside of them. Followed by Kroot in this category, and then gun drones show up too. Gun drones, pretty efficient. You get the 2 pulse carbines in there, and they do really well. I also want to point out the thing about Kroot here is Kroot are a top performer against this, like the basic Xenos profile, right? Toughness 3, okay save, 1 wound, right? Like Kroot do really well here. if we throw Monka on top of that, they are just going to be dialed up to 11, right? And that's only possible with Dal'Ith Sept, but something to keep in mind, right? Like, Kroot have a role that's clearly established here just based on this one element, not including all the other things that Kroot do on top of just having a gun and being able to shoot it. Moving on to Toughness 4 and a 6-up save with 1 wound. Again, Crisis Battlesuits. I will do a different video on all those different Crisis weapon loadouts because there are so many of them. There are a vast diversity of them that perform at the top of the list here. So we'll come back to those. We'll visit those. We'll talk about all the different weapons loadouts you might want to choose for the given role that you're selecting for them. So stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already to make sure you don't miss that. But we will be talking about that much more in depth at a later time. Gun drones show up here as well. The Cold Star Battlesuit, again, with the high output burst cannon. Specialist Pathfinders. Strike teams show up here, right? Strike teams do well against Toughness 4 with a 6-up save and 1 wound. Again, a notable inclusion here because they have been historically, at least within the past year or two, disfavored, right? And so now having them show up here, especially against Breachers, which are below them in this category, is refreshing. Then for Toughness 4 with a 3-up save and 1 wound, we have the Pathfinders, we have Breachers, we have Vespid for the first time in this video. Vespid are showing up, and spoiler alert, it's not going to be the last. Then the Crisis Suits, Strike Team, and the Cold Star again. Moving on to infantry that are Primaris size and larger, starting with Toughness 4, 3-up save and 2 wounds, your standard Primaris profile. We have the Specialist Pathfinders again, and this is where we kind of see things be kind of silly, and the Pathfinders just kind of hang out at the top of the list more or less for the rest of the video, so I'm just going to stop talking about them. Vespids come in here. Crisis Battlesuits following them. Again, we'll go over the exact loadout at a later date. Breachers, Broadsides with the heavy rail rifle show up for the first time here as well. They are something you're going to want to pay attention to in the rankings. Storm Surge with the driver cannon shows up here as well. And so the thing with the Storm Surge is I am assuming that it has its anchors down, and I am assuming that it's firing all of its weapons at one target. You may ask how I deal with the destroyer missiles for the Storm Surge. I am assuming that it's firing 1 missile per turn. It has 4 missiles. Yes, that means that it could be, it can't shoot 1 missile per turn if you go the full 5 turns, but in terms of this instantaneous comparison, assuming that it's firing 1 missile, I think is a fair assessment. So Storm Surge with the driver cannon shows up here. Then for Toughness 5, 3-up save, 3 wounds, this is like your Gravis Armor Marines. We have the Pathfinders, we have the Vespid. Again, this is the Vespid in isolation, right? So this is essentially how Vespid will perform on the tabletop for most armies, unless you're playing Dal'Ith, in which case they're going to get a little bit more of a boost. Then the Storm Surge with the driver cannon, Broadsides with the heavy rail rifle, Breachers, and Battlesuits again. The heavy rail rifle loadout, again, I will say, is generally better with the plasma rifle. I'm fine specifying that. The Smart Missile System doesn't perform as well on paper. So when I'm pointing out the heavy rail rifle loadout, it is primarily the plasma rifle loadout, not the Smart Missile Systems. Then for Toughness 5, 2-up save with 5 wounds, Pathfinders, Broadside with the rail rifle, Vespid, Hammerhead with a railgun. And this is also with the accelerator burst cannons on the side as opposed to any of the other options, although the other 2 options also perform comparably. But the accelerator burst cannon is the superior choice on paper. Crisis Battlesuits, and then the driver cannon Storm Surge again. Moving on to small vehicles and small monsters, starting with Toughness 5, 4-up save, 6 wounds. We got the Pathfinders, we got your Vespid, we got your heavy rail rifle Broadsides. Now we have the Blast Cannon Storm Surge, the Railgun Hammerhead again, and Crisis Battlesuits again. Toughness 6 with the 4-up save, 12 wounds, Pathfinders, heavy rail rifle Broadside, Railgun Hammerhead, Crisis Suits, Blast Cannon Storm Surge, and Vespid. Then for Toughness 7, 3-up save, 8 wounds, Pathfinders, heavy rail rifle Broadsides, Railgun Hammerhead, Blast Cannon Storm Surge, Crisis Battlesuits, and Vespid. So one of the biggest things one of the biggest takeaways for this, I think, is that the broadsides consistently outperform the hammerheads, right? Hammerheads are scary. They can pack a punch, but the broadsides here are outperforming them in terms of points efficiency. And I think that's an important takeaway that has some valuable implications for how you do want to build your army. Then we'll talk about that at the end here. Then looking at large monsters and vehicles, starting with toughness 8, 3-up save, and 12 wounds. We got the Pathfinders, we got the heavy rail rifle broadsides, we have the blast cannon storm surge, the railgun hammerhead, we have Vespids and crisis battlesuits. And again, I'll remind you, lots of different options for crisis battlesuits here. We'll talk about them more in the future. The crisis suits that are doing well in this category are different crisis suits than did well in the light infantry category, for example, right? There's different loadouts you're going to want to pick for these different categories, and so we will talk about those at a later date, about exactly what those loadouts will be. For toughness 8, 2-up save, 16 wounds, Pathfinders, heavy rail rifle broadside, blast cannon storm surge, railgun hammerhead, Vespid, crisis battlesuits. Toughness 8, 3-up save, 24 wounds, and a 5-up invulnerable save. Pathfinders, hammerhead, broadside, storm surge, Vespid, and then the driver cannon storm surge as well. So these three profiles basically have identical rankings for them, right? It's very consistent for this top level of vehicles. The toughness 8 vehicles are generally going to be responding very similarly to the different unit selections. So, right, we're looking at broadsides, hammerhead, storm surge, all being very good options here. Vespid, though, still retain their efficacy because their weapons are kind of a sweet spot, right? They're strength 5, so they're going to be wounding toughness 8 on 5s. They are minus 2 AP, which is good. It gets that good armor save up a little bit, pushes that 3-up armor save to a 5-up invulnerable save on the right profile there. And then it's 2 damage on top of that, right? So they're doing a good punch for what you pay for them. And they're just at the right spot that they do enough damage that they're not losing anything because of an invulnerable save, for example, right? Like, it just fits the niche very well. And so it's interesting that Vespids show up still as a very competitive choice for a wide diversity of models. Okay, and then moving on to things that have invulnerable saves. We just talked about one model that had an invulnerable save. We're going to focus now on things that have invulnerable saves because the presence of an invulnerable save changes things up quite a bit, right? If you have an invulnerable save, it doesn't matter if you have minus 6 AP because that invulnerable save is going to really reduce that efficacy. So looking at smaller things that have invulnerable saves, here we have toughness 2 with a 5-up save, 1 wound, and a 2-up invulnerable save. Crisis battlesuits. Again, this is going to be like basically things that have flamers, or 2 flamers and a burst cannon. Performs really well here. Specialist Pathfinders do well here because of the rail mechanic. Hammerheads, again, because of the rail mechanic. You probably aren't going to be shooting, the railgun at this, but in this case, you would rather opt for the submunitions stratagem, which is going to be much more effective. But still, even in the absence of that stratagem, you're getting good value here because of the mortal wounds on the railgun, and then the accelerator burst cannons are good here too. Gun drones, crude, strike teams, just volume of fire, making them effective against these targets as well. Toughness 3, 7-up save, 1 wound, 6++. Crisis battlesuits, crudes, gun drones, breachers, pathfinders, piranhas with a burst cannon. This is the only time piranha showed up. I was kind of surprised. I thought maybe the fusion blaster piranha would be more effective, and perhaps that's largely due to the assumption that we're not within Melta range, but still, piranhas I would have thought would have showed up more valuable than they did on paper here. So this is the only place they show up, and it's with the burst cannon fusion blaster. Interesting. For toughness 4, 2-up save, 2 wounds, 5++. We have the Pathfinders. We have our friends the Vespids showing up again. It's like they're bugs or something. They won't go away. They keep showing up on my slides. Breachers, the heavy rail rifle broadside, the railgun hammerhead, and then crisis suits again. So these are generally fairly similar to their counterparts without invulnerable saves, but we have the rail weapons show up here because rail has the mortal wound mechanic, and so it really does show its value in the context of something that has an invulnerable save. All right, and then finally looking at larger models that have invulnerable saves, Toughness 5, 2 up save, 2 wounds, 3++, Pathfinders, Hammerhead, Vespid, Breachers, Hammerhead with an ion cannon. Again, the standard profile here, so if you overcharge it, it would be more efficient, but you're probably going to be taking those mortal wounds because it doesn't have the ability to reroll ones. And then we have the Broadsides with high yield missile pod too showing up, right? So a little bit, I mean, there are some surprises here in the form of the ion cannon and the high yield missile pod Broadsides, which haven't showed up in our rankings yet. They show up here. Then for Toughness 6, 4 up save, 4 wounds, and a 4 up invulnerable save, we have the Pathfinders, we have your Crisis Suits, we have the Railgun Hammerhead, we have both Storm Surges with a Blast Cannon or Driver Cannon you pick, both effective here, and then the Rail Rifle Broadsides again. Toughness 7, 6 up save, 12 wounds, and a 5++. We got the Pathfinders, we got the Hammerhead, we got the Crisis, we got the Storm Surge, we got the Broadside again, right? This is, very, very consistent across these profiles. And so there aren't a lot of surprises here, right? Like there is the ion cannon, there is the high yield missile pods, but for the most part, the big strong weapons are doing well against the big strong targets. So, makes sense and is, not necessarily something to write home about, but it does cement the fact that the Storm Surge does have some value specifically in these contexts, right? It's one of those things where you thought maybe the Storm Surge wouldn't perform very well, but here it still shows up. It's still pulling some weight on paper. Okay, so what does this all mean for your army list? Well, again, it's just one piece of the puzzle. It's not going to be the thing that tells you specifically what you need to bring in order to win, right? That's going to vary across different players. It's going to vary against different metas, and it's going to vary based on, actually how you use those units. So this is just one bit of information to consider in the process. But these analyses do show us a few key takeaways. One is that the glass cannons are really glass cannons, right? If we look at those Pathfinder teams in the Vespid, both of them can punch very efficiently, right? They can put out a lot of damage for their points cost. But if we think about their profiles, they are both paper thin, right? You can shoot through both of them pretty darn easily. And so they have value while they are shooting, but when they are no longer shooting, they don't have that value. And that might be an obvious statement, but it's important to consider when we're looking at numbers like this, right? If your Pathfinders die, if your Vespid are not on the table, whether you haven't deployed them yet or they have deployed and are now gone, right? Regardless of the reason why they're not on the table, if they're not on the table, they're not doing work, and then you lose that efficiency. Right? So these numbers only make sense if you're actually utilizing them consistently compared to your alternative options, right? If we're looking at Pathfinders versus strike teams, for example, and strike teams are able to last on the table twice as long, well, then it doesn't matter if their efficiency is 25% lower because they're making up for it by being around for a lot longer. And that 25% number is not accurate. It's just an example. So yeah, right? Like glass cannons are glass cannons, but their value diminishes when they're off the table. Secondly, there are viable options for all the troop choices, right? Whether we're talking about breachers or strike teams or Kroot, all of them showed up as a top pick somewhere in this assessment. So they all have a good role to play. They all have some offensive capabilities, which you would want in your rank and file troop. But they also have special tricks, right? They have their stratagems, they have their utilities associated with them, and particularly for the Kroot, right? The Kroot are cheap and they move quickly, and they bring some friends with them. So there's lots of ways you can augment each of these unit types as well to make them fit your goal. So it's reassuring that each of them have this baseline efficiency built in, but what we're really going to be looking for is how you can build on top of that. Which one you pick is going to be dependent on your strategy. It's going to be dependent on your sept too, right? So it's good to see that they all have some efficiency built in, but you're going to be making your selection based on more than just that. And then finally, one of the biggest things that I noticed and appreciated that I was relieved to see, let's say, was that Crisis and Broadsides both show up consistently. And both Crisis and Broadsides bring a lot more to the table than just their shooting power, right? They're both core units, and they are both battle suits, which means a lot, really. It means that they're buffable, right? There are aura abilities, there are stratagems that key off that core word. The fact that they're battle suits means that they can take drones, right? That can support them. They also have a built-in durability on their own because they're in big tin cans. They can take a little bit more of a punch than someone that's not in a tin can. And because they're battle suits, they can shoot in melee too. So they bring a lot to the table just based on those keywords, but then to have this high efficiency shooting on top of that really makes them look appealing. And so there are high efficiency loadouts for crisis suits. There is a highly effective loadout in the form of the heavy rail rifle plasma loadout for the broadside that are both effective across the board, which suggests that they will have utility or value to you regardless of your opponent, which is important, right? You don't want to pick something that's only useful against one thing because you don't know if you're going to be playing against that. Because these are useful across the board, that suggests that they have staying value, which is good. And I think both of these units, at least the broadsides, were kind of downplayed in the pre-release coverage, right? Like we did hear a fair amount about crisis suits, but we really heard people talking about the hammerheads. We really heard people talking about the storm surges. And yes, those are good. Those showed up consistently in our analysis as well. But keep in mind, the broadside did better in a lot of cases. And it has these extra benefits, right? It's buffable, it's durable, it can shoot in melee. The hammerhead can shoot in melee too, so can the storm surge, but not in the same way. So there are clear advantages for the broadside over those other options as well. So again, giving you options, giving you variation in your build, and suggesting that this codex as a whole is going to be one that you can customize to play the way you want to play, which is awesome to see. So those are the top 6 most efficient units for a diversity of targets. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this useful to you or not? Do you want me to run these analyses with other consideration? Put them in the comments and we'll see what we can do. As always, thanks for watching and happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. A while ago I made my own miniature. If you are interested in showing your support for the channel on the tabletop, you can pick one up either on Etsy if you're in the US or directly through me worldwide. Special thanks to our sponsor, the Magnet Baron, and also all the good folks over on Patreon, especially Mate Monk, Marcy, A Little Pink Monster, Bennaby Jones, Durza, Ever Keller, Robbie Goodwin, Jose Gomez, Ruger, Drew Pratley, Michael Byrne, Zealous Brimstone, Scott Heater, Stephen Cowan, Jared Egler, Chris Kessler, Tao Oswald, and Shifty.